Hello and welcome back to the Sydney Dialogue, a world first summit for emerging critical and cyber technologies. Sydney Dialogue commenced in November 2021 with several interesting sessions and keynote addresses from Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. I'm delighted to be here today to facilitate our next session, Increasing Resilience in a Post-Pandemic World. I'm Jane Halton, and I'm the chair of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, a global partnership launched in 2017 to develop vaccines and prevent future epidemics. COVID-19 has created unprecedented disruption to our economic, health and travel systems. The pandemic has demonstrated the importance of governments, scientists and industry leaders working together to ensure healthy and thriving communities. How will this relationship rewrite itself in the wake of the pandemic? In this fantastic panel discussion, speakers will look at how governments, scientists, and industry leaders can better work together to protect global health and promote economic recovery using technology. It's a great honour to be speaking with such an eminent panel today from various corners of the globe. Thank you all for being here. So, we have a distinguished panel and we should start with an introduction. We have in front of us three very distinguished speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, who is the Executive Chairperson of Biocon and Biocon Biologics, India's largest pharmaceutical company. She is a pioneering engineer, biotech engineer, a healthcare visionary, a global influencer and a passionate philanthropist. During COVID-19, she's been championing the cause of the healthcare industry and helping find innovative solutions to combat the pandemic. Welcome. Next, of course, we have the Honourable Mathias, Secretary General of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Prior to his appointment to the OECD, he served as the Australian Minister for Finance and leader of the Australian Government in the Senate as a federal senator representing the state of Western Australia. And we have Dr. Simon Milner, Vice President of Public Policy for the Asia Pacific region at Meta. Welcome to all of our panellists. The Sydney Dialogue is an open discussion which we invite you all to be part of. If you're on Twitter, you can take part using the hashtag the Sydney Dialogue. So, let's get right to it. I'd like to start today's discussion by asking each of the panellists, given their roles, what they have learnt so far from this pandemic. And I might start with the Secretary General. The OECD recently released a paper which draws lessons from evaluations that governments have carried out themselves during the course of this pandemic and looking at their responses. So, Secretary General, can you talk us through the findings of this research in this paper? What are the most important insights that emerged and how can we feed these into our ongoing policy responses to this crisis?
We recently released a report summarising the evaluations by auditors and parliamentary commissions in 18 countries, which looked at the lessons learned so far from the pandemic. And there were a number of common themes. Firstly, even though a pandemic like this one was entirely predictable, it is clear that pandemic preparedness was generally insufficient. Though once the pandemic hit, governments took swift and massive action to mitigate the economic and financial effects of the pandemic. But there is a need now to carefully monitor and address the longer-term budgetary impacts of these measures, as necessary as they were. Trust requires transparency, not only through frequent and targeted crisis communication, but more importantly, by engaging stakeholders and the public in risk-related decision-making. The other thing that came through is that the crisis revealed yet again the value, in fact the importance of interagency cooperation, which requires strong political leadership from the top and fit-for-purpose governance structures. It was also clear that tax measures played an important role in supporting the liquidity of households and businesses, but that unlike spending, did not always target the right beneficiaries. Learning from the global financial crisis, countries did deploy significant measures to support self-employed workers. A more detailed analysis of the evaluations highlights those several knowledge gaps that would benefit from further work. Firstly, there's insufficient evidence on critical sectors' preparedness for pandemics, whereas early evaluations suggested that they were critically important to an effective crisis response. And secondly, the actual effectiveness of lockdowns and other severe restriction measures does require further sober evidence-based assessment, given their severe impacts on individual liberties. And thirdly, we should assess the impact of lockdowns on domestic violence, alcohol consumption, youth, and mental health.
Well, I think there's an awful lot to consider there. So we'll come back to a number of those things, I suspect. Let me just move now, though, to Kiran. And you are the executive chairperson of India's largest biopharmaceutical company. What have you learnt in that role as we've gone through this pandemic? What lessons have you taken from our experience to date?
Well, I think every one of us, whether it's a country or a corporation, I think we have realized that we need to be in a state of preparedness. And I think pandemic preparedness, as Mathias just talked about, is extremely important and something that is now becoming a focus of everyone who has been affected by this pandemic. As a company, I think we realized that there's been an unexpected disruption in supply chains, in various kind of manufacturing activities. And, you know, it also helped us to then rely a lot on technology to really recover from these disruptions. So I think what the pandemic has done globally is unleashed digital transformation and the potential of using these various digital technologies to be resilient. So as a company, we have started investing massively in digital technologies that also focus on addressing many of these disruptions that we were not prepared for. So logistics and supply chains have been broken, and we need to really now, get back into, fixing all these broken chains, so to speak. And I think digital technologies are helping a lot to do that. And as an organization, as you know, being a manufacturing organization, working from home was not an option for a large number of our employees. So whilst 50% of us could work from home, the remaining 50% had to be on site. And I can tell you it was very challenging during the pandemic to keep everyone safe and uninfected. So I think the recognition that you need to focus on automation and be much more focused on digital technologies to prevent these disruptions is something that we've now taken on board, investing a lot in using these technologies and trying to see how we can prevent such eventualities in the future. So I think it's taught us a lot. And I'm glad to say that in the last at least 6 months, we have seen a huge amount of recovery within our organization from what we initially faced, which really impacted our business substantially. So now we're kind of coming back to normal growth, so to speak, and normal functioning, so to speak. So yes, lots of lessons learned, but I can tell you that most organizations around the world are beginning to massively invest in digital platforms and digital technologies to run their businesses in the future. So Industry 4.0, as we all call it, is now becoming an accelerated reality.
So I think you've hit a couple of really important nails on the head there. Most of us would never have had a conversation about supply chain, and now we talk about them all the time. But you've given me the perfect segue to our next guest, Simon, technology. It's important for the future. It's been important as part of this this whole pandemic experience. And you at Meta, what have you and Meta learnt about this experience? What are the strengths and weaknesses, do you think, in the responses we've seen around the world, from governments, from political operatives, technological, scientific, and civil society leaders? What's been good? What's been bad? And what does the future look like?
Wow, there's a lot in that question, Jane, and thanks very much for having me here. And I just want to build on what Kiran had to say about the biggest lesson for us as a company, and certainly for me personally, is just to really kind of be humbled by how important our technologies, our products, from WhatsApp to Facebook and Instagram, were for, frankly, billions of people, for their families, for their communities, for the organizations that they work in, and for the many, many governments that we engage with during the course of this pandemic, how incredibly important, not just our technologies, but frankly, all communication technologies and devices have been, and also for the internet, the incredible importance of the internet. Imagine if we'd had to go through this pandemic without those technologies. How much harder would it have been to frankly deal with the problems we had around isolation, around how do you keep organizations going when you don't want people to move around very much and to interact with other human beings in the real world. So frankly, technologies really come to our aid. It was important already, of course it was, but I think it's just become much more important to more people for more of the time, for more things that we do. And as a company running some of the biggest kind of platforms in the world, used by half the world's population, that was quite humbling. And we knew it really heightened the sense of responsibility that we have to ensure that our products are working, that they're available, that they're open, that they serve everyone, that we're adapting them in light of the feedback that we're getting. And of course, there were then some particular issues where we really needed to massively up our activity around partnering with health organizations. We already had some experience in this area, for instance, around blood donation in certain countries. But we certainly had not worked with the WHO and many other health organizations in the way that we've done over the last 2 years to ensure that people get authoritative health information, that we address the problem of misinformation. I expect we'll talk a bit more about that, but also then supporting small businesses. As Kiran said, her company had to massively invest in digital transformation, and they're one of millions of companies that had to do that. And we know that particularly for small businesses, just keeping going, investing in digital technology, often not necessarily a lot of money, but changing the way they engage with their customers was hugely important to their survival. And so we were really, that was an important part of our work. I think there are a tremendous number of lessons for us as a company, for governments, for big organizations and small. And I actually think we're still at the start of kind of really understanding those lessons. As Mathias was saying, there's a lot of analysis still to be done, for instance, around lockdowns and what the right approach is. So we very much want to be part of that process of learning as we emerge, frankly, at different paces around Asia as well as the rest of the world. But as we emerge from this, we want to be part of that dialogue, much like the one you've initiated at ASPI, to learn the lessons from the pandemic.
Indeed. Kiran, can you just talk to us a little bit about what role you think science has had and how important that's been in the developing countermeasures against global and regional crises, such as things like a pandemic? Or we could think more broadly, couldn't we, about environmental disasters issue in relation to humanitarian considerations. How important is science, do you think, to the human race's capacity to deal with these shocks?
Well, I think this pandemic has certainly shown you that science is foundational to everything we need to do to counter these kind of natural, unexpected disasters. And I think we have clearly shown that if it wasn't for our scientific prowess in the world, we could not have developed vaccines at such speed and scale the way we did. I mean, to think that this pandemic actually saw the birth of mRNA vaccines was a big revelation of how strong science is to respond to such pandemics. And I think apart from that, of course, the vaccine effort, you yourself know that CEPI invested in a large number of vaccine programs to make sure that the world, across the board, was looking at number of technologies so that we hedged the risk of all the vaccines and made sure that at least many of those vaccines would actually help to combat the pandemic. So I think science really came to the fore during the pandemic, so much so that even in a country like India, the investment in science, the investment in healthcare has greatly increased, exponentially, I would say. And the recognition that you need to invest in science is now worldwide. I think every country wants to invest in vaccine technology, but that's not enough. You have to then use the pandemic to invest much deeper in science, because it's about healthcare. It's about solving many other problems, environmental problems, healthcare problems. And science is foundational to solving these big challenges, whether it's climate change challenges, whether it's healthcare challenges, whether it's pandemics, you name it. I think science has to be invested in, because it is only the scientific innovation and new ideas that will actually help solve this problem. And as Simon said, I mean, if you think about it, look at information technology. Without information technology, we would not be having this conversation today. We've made communication omnipresent. I mean, today I think we're getting quite used to having virtual panel discussions, so much so that, you know, everyone feels that, do you really need to meet up in a conference and travel great distances to have these kind of conversations? Well, the answer is yes, it would be nice. But at the same time, we've managed, right? All these years. I mean, 2 years of our normal lives has been disrupted. I mean, many of us have not traveled. We are always on a plane in the past, and now for almost over a year or two, many people have not traveled. So I think it has disrupted our lives, but it has also made us realize and appreciate what life is all about. And I think science also has played a big, big role in us understanding that if it wasn't for science, we would be in a very bad space. So I'm really, really excited and proud to be in that scientific sector, where, you know, we've developed, whether it's vaccines at warp speed, whether we've developed diagnostics at warp speed, whether we've developed, therapeutics at warp speed to combat this pandemic. I think things have been happening at a pace and scale that we never imagined before. That's the excitement that this pandemic has actually unleashed. And I really hope that countries will start investing much more significantly in science and technology, and of course in healthcare and climate change. So I know that in India, we are certainly taking this very seriously. As you know, India has always been underinvested in healthcare, underinvested in research and science, and underinvested in many of the environmental challenges that we have. But today, I think there's a clear recognition that we need to invest much more in healthcare. India only invests, typically about less than 1% in healthcare as a percentage of GDP. We have now decided to treble that investment. If you think about how little we invest in research and innovation, it's only 0.7% of GDP, and that has to now double. To really sort of make us relevant in terms of being a strong science-led, knowledge-led country. And that's what it's all about. I mean, I myself am involved with the state of Karnataka, where I live, has started a Karnataka digital economy mission, where we clearly recognize the power of the digital economy. And I think that's where we really want to focus on skills, on business opportunities and employment. So I think it's a very exciting time because it's completely disrupted the way we think about economic growth, economic opportunities, and employment. So I just think it's a time that we really need to pivot and really change the way we think about the future.
Yes, and you've raised one particular issue, which is certainly something that I'm particularly passionate about. And you've talked about how everybody wants to be engaged in technology. I mean, one of the things, sadly, we've seen in this pandemic is that in low-income countries, it is still sadly the case that only about 10% of people have received one or more doses of vaccine. So this question about the equitable access to technology and to the products of technology, and then hence to health outcomes, I think is one of the lessons that I think all countries have taken from this pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. But I just want to add there that India was in a fortunate position that it had invested in a huge vaccine industry.
Yes.
And thanks to the scale of vaccine production that we had in the country, we were able to quickly, vaccinate, India has over 1 billion people. And we were able to quickly vaccinate our population. And I think that was a phenomenal job. And the even more impressive part of the immunization program for this pandemic was the fact that we actually did it on a very comprehensive digital platform, yes, which I think was extremely impressive. So to date, we have almost, immunized almost 70% of our eligible population with 2 vaccine shots. And we have done a tremendous job of reaching out to the most remotest areas of India in this vaccine initiative. The reason being that we have been immunizing our populations for other diseases over the years, and we basically leverage those capabilities and capacities to do the same for COVID-19. So I just think that countries do need to, look at healthcare much more seriously. I think immunization is now something that the world will have to accept as a way of life. And I think, getting to, focus on this inequity that you talked about is going to be very crucial. Because as you said, in the LMIC countries, only 10% of the people have received these doses, which I think is unacceptable.
Absolutely.
So inequity is something that we need to focus on. But for that, we need to make sure that there is a strong focus on capacity building and on the logistics and supply chains that are required to deliver these vaccines. Because it's one thing to basically send vaccines to poor countries, but it's another thing to deploy those vaccines into the arms of people. So I think many, many challenges ahead, but I think this pandemic has actually been an eye-opener and an awakening in terms of how we look at global healthcare.
Indeed it has. And one of the things that you've pointed to, and I'd like to turn now to Simon, if I could, is the challenge in this pandemic of actually, for example, getting vaccines into arms. And we know that technology, social media, etc., has been unbelievably important in terms of keeping people connected, ensuring that people can, in some instances, work. But at the same time, we've seen the challenge of misinformation. And in many countries where we are struggling to get vaccines rolled out, it's not just access to vaccines, it is that kind of misinformation, vaccine hesitancy, etc., that is spread on social media. So what role do you think technology and companies such as yours have, and what lessons have you learned from this experience?
Well, look, thanks a lot, Jane, for bringing up that issue. I think it's hugely important. We know that a lot of people get information via social media, and therefore we have an important role to play when it comes to a public health crisis like this, especially given how many, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people are using our products every day. And so we took this very seriously. So, and with 2 main areas of focus. One is about providing authoritative information. So we launched a COVID health hub where we partnered with either the World Health Organization or with local health authorities, so that when people first opened the app or when they were looking for information on one of our services, they would be directed to this information center. So they would get authorities information. And we know that during the course of the pandemic, some 2 billion people access one of these health hubs at least once. So that was very important. Now, turning to the issue of misinformation, you're absolutely right. And one thing we know about every technology, every form of communication in human history, including when all we could do is talk to each other when we learned to talk, one of the challenges is that people will spread rumors, sometimes with no bad intent. I've heard this, have you heard that? And sometimes with bad intent. And sometimes, indeed, governments using information technology to spread misinformation in order to disrupt another country's information system. So very challenging. We've got a lot of experience in dealing with misinformation, and we were able to deploy our approach to this when it came to issues around COVID-19 and in particular around vaccines. So a number of things that we did. One is that there's certain types of misinformation that we simply delete. Because it could cause real-world harm. And so there are many types of information relating to COVID-19 and vaccines that we simply removed, including when it came from very senior politicians, including leaders of major countries who spread misinformation. And we would remove that. No matter who it is, we'd remove it. Now, there are other things where people kind of understandably are debating issues. And of course, especially in the early days of the vaccine program, Kiran and yourself will know this well, there was a lot of debate, genuine debate about, are these vaccines safe? What's the right kind of vaccine? How will they work, etc. And that's when we work with third-party fact-checking organizations to help, rather than us as meta deciding what's accurate, what's not, working with those third-party fact-checkers in many countries around this region as well as the rest of the world to fact-check information that was potentially going viral on our platforms. And what we found is that when we applied labels to that kind of content, in 95% of circumstances, when somebody saw a label that said, hey, this post likely contains false information, people would not click through that warning. They would not look at the content. And so that was a very important way of dealing with misinformation. Now, then of course the question is, well, what impact does it have? What difference does it make to vaccine hesitancy, or maybe looking at it the other way, vaccine acceptance? And actually on that, we did some pioneering research with Carnegie Mellon and the University of Maryland, a survey that was surfaced to everybody on Facebook on a regular basis, and some 38 million people have responded to the survey during the course of the pandemic. And we asked a number of questions about people's health, but also about their attitude towards vaccines. And we found that actually we saw increases in vaccine acceptances across most countries during this period, and some by a sizable amount. So 35% increase in France. Those of you who know France, you'll know that France has a history of being rather hesitant about vaccines, but also 25% increase in Indonesia, 20% increase in Nigeria. So there are examples of not only how we can provide good information, deal with misinformation, but also try and help scientists and health organizations understand what is happening in terms of public attitudes towards vaccines. And it was wonderful hearing what Kiran had to share about the vaccine story in India. What an incredible achievement for India. And there are many other countries which have also had incredible success. Indonesia, which started slow and then has had a really strong success in its vaccine program. And we've played a small part in that. We can't put needles in people's arms. That's not what our services do, but we can certainly help to ensure that more people get good information and take the right step in getting vaccinated.
So let's move, if we might now, and I'm interested in some crisp views on this, if I could. We've talked about the lessons we've learned, we've talked about the experiences we've had, all of which have been challenging, in some cases life-changing, in some cases they have genuinely changed the way we think about our lives and how the world works. But if we look into the future now, And brief if we might, let's start by asking, what does resilience look like in the future, given what we now know? I'm going to go to the Secretary-General first. Mathias Cormann.
Well, we need better anticipation and preparation for possible future disruptions. This requires a commitment to strategic foresight and horizontal interdisciplinary policy making. One of the core tenets of anticipatory governance is that governments should be preparing for multiple possible future scenarios rather than a single expected future. There is a need to be better prepared for any future external shocks or major potential disruptions. And that was, again, clearly demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So resilience in the future involves policies that are stress tested against multiple possible future scenarios, including some that are highly disruptive and might seem implausible. This is a way to ensure policies are robust across a range of possible future scenarios and that we're better protected from potential blind spots. Achieving such anticipatory governance requires a horizontal approach within governments and across international organizations. Because many of the most disruptive developments occur at the intersection of different sectors and are easily missed if we continue to operate within siloed domains of expertise. So future resilience, and that is really the key point, requires interdisciplinarity.
And on that basis, Simon, what's your prescription for future resilience?
I'd say three things that we've learned. One is the importance of building a healthy information ecosystem around other issues. We're very focused, for instance, on the issues of climate change and how we can help in terms of a healthy information ecosystem there. Secondly, and building on what Kiran had to say, I think encouraging digital transformation, very much something where we can partner, we'd like to partner with industry organizations, with governments and others to understand what works here and how we can enable, whether it's small businesses in the bush in Australia or in the Pacific Islands, to larger bodies like health organizations, etc. Digital transformation is essential. And then the third one, I think this is potentially the biggest issue from our perspective, is we really need to protect a global vision for the open internet. We see many different countries at the moment that are regulating in this space. We recognize that. We agree. We think that the internet should be more regulated than it is now. But doing so in a way which is protected, which is very much focused on kind of national sovereignty, and particularly thinking about trying to compel the localization of data or preventing the free flow of data. That's exactly the opposite way to go. If we want to build resilience for the world, we need to have free flow of data. And we need people to be able to access global services globally, like ours and like many others around the world. In fact, we're very, very worried about this trend, and I'm afraid it is in our region. It's in Asia, where we see more of these examples probably than anywhere else in the world, and it's very worrying. So we can't just assume that the open internet will inevitably continue. It won't if we don't fight for it. So that's incredibly important for resilience.
And we've already heard, I think, Kiran, from you a little bit about the future and digitization, et cetera, et cetera. What would you add, again, pithy, what are the top 3 or 4 things for you in terms of what resilience looks like into the future?
So to start with, I think the way we look at risk itself has changed, risk assessment, risk planning, all that has changed dramatically because, we were not even prepared for a pandemic to disrupt our businesses so dramatically. So like Mathias said, I think we need to really look at implausible risks which we had not considered before. So that's one aspect of resilience that we need to look at in terms of how we look at risk. Secondly, I think we also need to look at regional and global, partnerships like we have in the Quad to really look at how we collaborate and build these, preparedness kind of models going forward. So I think the 4 partners that we have that have got together in the Quad, which is, the US, India, Japan, and Australia, we need to really leverage the respective strengths that we have in these countries to see how we can keep these regions safe, how we can basically keep the world, connected through science and technology. So I think science and technology diplomacy is really going to be extremely important in the future. And I think in terms of resilience, how do we get back to economic growth in the pre-pandemic world is really the question. And today, I think technology is driving that resilience in terms of coming back to normalcy. So I feel very optimistic that the world will come back to pre-pandemic levels of economic growth, but the economic growth is going to be very different. It is going to be technology-led growth. And there, I think I worry that a lot of the poorer countries may get left behind in what we call as the digital divide. So it is our collective responsibility to make sure that we don't let that digital divide happen, and that we actually bring and pull everyone into the digital economy, because that's the way the world is going to go in the next 10 to 50 years ahead.
And beyond, I suspect, indeed. Secretary General, how do we build or rebuild systems to be more resilient and to ensure we can mitigate against this risk of future pandemics? What about the implications we've seen emerge around supply chains? We've already had a bit of a talk about that, and manufacturing.
But crises like the COVID-19 pandemic reveal what can happen when systemic risks become reality, and resilience is put to the test in our globalized economies and societies. The global openness and integration brings many important benefits, not least lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But shocks like this one can lead to severe global economic downturns as impacts cascade through interconnected systems and sectors. We need to build system resilience to better address these inherently uncertain, unpredictable, and random shocks. So building resilience across our economies as a whole calls for a systemic policy approach to a wide range of known and unknown risks, from pandemics and climate change to developments in globalization and emerging technologies. A systemic approach should include policies that help prevent the build-up of vulnerabilities and reduce exposure to shocks, absorb shocks when they do occur, and help economies recover rapidly and sustainably through adaptation and transformation. Across our economies, resilience-based approaches can help policymakers plan and prepare, absorb, recover, and adapt. Resilience must become a core philosophy within system management and operation to ensure these systems are able to continue to function despite disruptions like COVID-19. So consideration must be given not only to hardening systems, but a range of critical systems connected to it, which involves examining how risk is absorbed and mitigated by these systems, how they will recover, adapt, and preferably bounce forward. Last year we prepared a report for the G7 on this precise issue. It identified 3 policy areas where international cooperation is critical and would bring substantial benefits for all countries. Firstly, we need to strengthen the resilience of global supply chains, particularly for essential goods. And there is no one-size-fits-all policy here. Given the diversity of potential shocks and the types of essential goods required under different circumstances, policy options may differ significantly from one crisis to another. Such policy responses may include horizon scanning and scenario planning, stress tests of supply chains, more agile and flexible regulation, trade facilitation, strategic stockpiling of essential goods, upstream agreements with firms to increase supply, such as advance purchase contracts, repurposing production capacity, pooling resources, or surplus sharing agreements between countries, to name just a few. Most policy responses would benefit from close partnership between government and the private sector. That is self-evident. Such partnerships could take the form of strategic public procurement and public and private cooperation, or other measures, to ensure the provision of essential goods while ensuring economies remain open, competitive, and transparent. Similarly, efforts to strengthen the resilience of global supply chains to respond to rapid surges or shifts in demand, as we have seen, supply and logistics challenges, which we've also seen, should be done in close partnership while respecting the different roles of the public and private sectors and ensuring high standards of responsible business conduct are respected. Many governments, Canada, Estonia and the UK, for example, have developed closer partnerships with the private sector to identify innovative solutions to public needs. Others, such as Italy, Ireland, the United States, have sought to diversify their suppliers' portfolio to increase suppliers' preparedness to respond to peaks in demand by managing stockpiles or buffers, as in Finland. There are many different opportunities, but there's no one-size-fits-all, and it's going to be very important, though, to think these things through. Second, improving the international rulebook to make global markets more predictable and reliable, such as the market for critical minerals, for example, is also important, notably by addressing distortions and imbalances, which are sources of vulnerability, and by leveling the global economic playing field. Thirdly, addressing the challenges stemming from the digital transformation of our economies and from emerging technologies. Emerging technologies can be both sources of vulnerability and a safeguard for future resilience through improved innovation policies, financing models, and regulatory approaches. So looking ahead to future pandemic preparedness, we also need to consider the role of science and technology, which has played an enormous role throughout the COVID crisis. The scientific community has been central to helping governments understand and limit the spread of the virus and to develop effective vaccines and treatments in record time. In the first few months of the pandemic alone, like in the period March to September 2020, national research funding bodies worldwide spend around $5 billion US on emergency funding for COVID-19 related research and development. But the pandemic has also stretched research and innovation systems very much to their limits. This should really be a wake-up call to rethink science, technology and innovation policies to help us transition to more sustainable, equitable and resilient societies and prepare for future crises, such as the one we're still living today.
And that, of course, involves not just policymakers and governments. Simon, what's the role of industry in this future? From your perspective, and we know that there are all sorts of international negotiations and treaties and all sorts of other instruments that can be used, are our current approaches fit for purpose? Where do you see industry fitting into a world that thinks more comprehensively about preparedness?
Well, look, we've got a lot of experience of this we can share. We run some of the biggest information networks in the world. We have our own or shared subsea cables around the world. We've got many, many data centers around the world, and we need these in order for our products to work. We want to be in a position where, whether you're in the Solomon Islands or Bangalore, if you upload a photo to your Instagram feed, then anybody who's following you anywhere in the world can all see it at the same time. That involves incredible infrastructure, as you can imagine, and we have to ensure that it works. And we had a big learning experience during the pandemic when our services did go down for a period, and we had to figure out what went wrong there. There was, as often the case, actually a fairly simple explanation, but we need to share that, and indeed we do. We open source a lot of this technology so that other people can learn from that. And I think that almost that approach that has been common, for instance, in the airline industry, that when something goes wrong, everybody gets to learn about what went wrong and what we can do about it. And that's why now in the airline industry, it's pretty rare that you get a major accident, because it's been a culture of learning. Now, we also have that within our industry, and I think that's something that governments need to have. And I think we've seen it. I mean, you've probably been closer to this than me, Jane, but governments have come together. They've realized they need to cooperate. And some of these international fora, like the OECD and the World Health Organization, have become more important for us. And frankly, I think we have a role to play as industry in working together when there are areas of alignment, in showing up at these international fora and playing our part as part of the global dialogue. and that obviously governments must lead, but I think industry should aim to be a partner. And that's certainly what we seek, including through things like the Sydney Dialogue, which is a classic example of how we learn together. So we're committed to continuing to doing that and to share what we've learned from this pandemic in terms of and how we've become a more resilient company as a result of this.
Thank you. And if I can just briefly go to Kiran, you've mentioned supply chain a couple of times. Many of us, I think, now understand the strength and the benefit of a level of redundancy in our supply chain that possibly hasn't been top of mind for most of us. But I'm interested in your view about what we've seen in terms of scientific equipment, access to scientific knowledge, etc. What do you think we should be thinking about for the future in order that we can be much better prepared and hopefully prevent this kind of experience happening again? What are the key things you want us to think about?
Yeah, so I think you raised a very important point, because one of the big challenges that industry had during the pandemic was access to many of the critical components in even making vaccines, for that matter, or getting drugs across to different parts of the world. And things like that. So I think there is a clear need to have a very strong cooperation between regions and between countries. And I think most countries have also realized that there needs to be some amount of self-reliance. I mean, that's also something that has happened because of the pandemic. So I think many countries that have been, very reliant on, key raw materials or components for certain products have started realizing that there needs to be a second sourcing kind of approach where you start developing some of these capabilities to make sure that you don't get so badly impacted. I know that many vaccine makers in India were very impacted because they couldn't get access to key components, raw materials, and they had to wait quite a while before they could ramp up their vaccine manufacturing capacities. So these kind of aspects of supply chains which was not previously felt came to the fore. So I think companies are getting more prepared about not being single sourced in key materials, key raw materials. I also want to say that companies today are also very focused on other unexpected disasters like cybersecurity risks. I think many companies have found that many of their operations come to a standstill because of hacking. And that's another big risk that companies are beginning to understand, that as you get more and more into the digital world, I think Simon has put across this whole challenge very, very clearly, that companies need to think very differently about the way they run their businesses, the way they protect their businesses. And in all of this, I think there needs to be some amount of regulation, because I think the internet is a very powerful system, a communication and a platform that nobody can do without. But equally, I think there needs to be some amount of regulation. Otherwise, I don't know how we're going to solve a lot of the other unintended consequences of technology. So it's a very interesting time. I would say it's an inflection point in the world in terms of how we look at the economy, how we look at the environment, how we look at equity. And I think a lot of these issues are now coming to the fore. The rich and the poor, the East and the West, the underprivileged and the privileged. There's so many of these inequities that are coming to the fore, and we know that we are all in it together. That's one thing the pandemic has shown us, that you cannot isolate yourself or insulate yourself against such global impacts. So I think, that is something that we all need to understand. And it is about collaboration, cooperation, and partnerships. And I think every one of us has talked about it, which I think is going to be extremely important, whether it is supply chains, whether it is pandemic preparedness, or whether it is just resilience. I think shared knowledge is the way forward.
wholeheartedly endorse that sentiment. Now, I'm very conscious that we've had a rich discussion. There's so much we could continue to talk about, but sadly we will run out of time, and I'm conscious that our audience have given us a number of questions. So I'm just going to pick one of those questions, and we'll take some brief answers to this if we could. And this comes from Danielle in Tokyo. Technological and scientific advances appear to predominantly be the result of sustained and targeted investments by the public and the private sectors in areas like research, development, systems and people. Does the panel believe the pandemic has given governments around the world a wake-up call as to the importance of forward-thinking and strategic science and technology policy? And in particular, how well do you think the Indo-Pacific is faring in terms of both policy development and lining up the types of investments we believe the region needs? Now, let's be clear, we could all talk about this for hours. So headlines, what do you think? And let me go to Kiran first. A brief answer for Danielle in Tokyo.
So I certainly believe that it has really put the spotlight on the role of governments in driving science and technology. And I think the US has been doing it in a very smart way. And I think they were able to quickly pivot during the pandemic and really invest and get the vaccines out to the world in record time. And I think many of the countries followed that example. I think in India, we finally got the government to wake up and start investing in science and technology, which they had been lagging behind for a long time. And I think many parts of the world, whether it's Australia and many other parts of the world, I think have realized that their science policies have to be very, very pragmatic. They have to up the ante when it comes to investing in these very important sectors. So I, for one, feel, yes, I think the pandemic has put that focus.
That's fantastic. Simon, what's your take?
Look, the headline is that actually the Indo-Pacific region, there isn't a single answer, because this is a hugely diverse region with many different experiences. Some of the countries that were doing incredibly well in the early stage of the pandemic, now it's questionable about whether they took the right approach, and others that were seen to do badly have now seen to be doing really well. So it's just an incredibly interesting race, if that's what you want to call it. And it's one of the reasons why learning the lessons from this will actually take years. And also, frankly, why I really feel for policymakers. I mean, part of my job is to try and help them make good decisions. I think making good decisions during this pandemic has been harder than probably any other time as a policymaker. So credit to them for serving, for stepping up, to take on these tough jobs, and to actually try and make decisions, because somebody has to. So I'm proud of the fact that we have some great leaders around this region who've made tough decisions, and we appreciate the work that they've done. So yeah, that's my answer to Danielle.
Well, I hope Danielle appreciates that answer. I think we have probably run out of time in this fascinating discussion. I hope you agree with me that this has been a really interesting conversation, and I want to thank our three really brilliant panellists for their contribution today. Thank you to the Sydney Dialogue sponsors, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Meta, and of course a big thank you to you, our Sydney Dialogue audience, for tuning in. Don't forget you can continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #TheSydneyDialogue. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon for an interesting conversation.